Today we're going to be talking about animation inside of 3ds Max, specifically what we can animate and what we can't animate, how we animate it, exactly how we can adjust our animation, how we can adjust things like our frame rate, and anything else we can think of along the way. So the first thing I want to go over is the animation inside of 3ds Max, how we can kind of set it up to help us animate inside of 3ds Max. The first thing I want to talk about in that regards is our timeline. And our timeline is down at the bottom. And by default, we have a range from 0 to 100. And we have our slider. Our slider lets us slide between our keyframes. By default, we see just our numbers on our keyframes and our slider. But to make it a little bit easier, what I'd like you to do is to right-click on that timeline, and we're going to go to Configure, and we want everything here to be turned on. So Show Selection Range, which will show us our keyframes that we have selected. And then we also want to turn on our soundtrack. So even though we don't have sound in here, if we did, it would show it down at the bottom. Okay, so we've got that set up, and that's just going to help us animate a little bit easier. The next thing I want to do is go over our frame rate, what frame rate means and all that. And the easiest way, or one of the easiest ways to get there, is just to go to our time configuration. And that's down here at the bottom right, time configuration. So I'm going to click on that. And under time configuration, under frame rate, I can change all kinds of things. If I want to go to PAL, which I believe is European, and whatever, I can adjust the keys. I can also change my frame rate. So by default, let's see if we can adjust it. Custom here, then I can change my frame rate. So for example, most movies that you watch are not 30 frames per second. I believe they're 29 or 24. But most video games that you play, when you animate them, you animate at 30 frames per second. If you wanted to animate it at 60 frames per second, you can do that, or 120, or just whatever you want it to do. This is an easy way to change it. Also, for our timeline, the number in our timeline, maybe we don't want 0 to 80. Maybe we don't want whatever. We're just going to do our own. So you can adjust it here under animation, our start time and our end time. So I'm going to take that end time back to 100 and click OK. And that's not changing for us, so I'm just going to do it manually. Okay, so I'm going to go back into that timeline. Well, maybe we want the start time to be 30 instead of 100 or 0. Or maybe I want my length to be 120. And so it will kind of change that for us based on these things. Also, our playback, we want to have real time on, which will play it back real time. And what I recommend is, even though we're working in one viewport, I recommend to turn active viewport only off. Only so that if you do have 4 panes open, which, let's click this, and by default we would kind of see this action here. If we have active viewport only, then it will only show us our animation in our active viewport, which we see because we have this yellowish orange line around our view. But if we turn that off, we'll be able to see our animation in any view that we're in. Now that might make it a little bit more graphic intensive, so you might have a little bit more lag or frame stutter or whatever you want to call it, but I would recommend doing that because then you can see it from all different angles if you're using more than one viewport. Also, loop. Do we want to loop through our animation, or do we just want to play to the end to stop? So loop is by default. Our speed is how fast it's playing. So 1x is regular time. If we did 2x, that's twice as fast. 4x, 4 times as fast, so on and so forth. Same with 1/2 and 1/4. So we can change all of those anytime we want to. Okay, now that we've kind of got a little bit more understanding of how it's going to work and kind of have things set up, let's go ahead and create something and maybe just animate it real quick. So I'm going to just select a box, and I'm just going to make a box just so we can view what's going on. And what I want to go over is, we already know how to move objects. You know, either move, rotate, or scale. Well, any of these things can be animated, but what we see is that when I move something, it just kind of stays there, and if I move my slider, everything just kind of stays there. I'm going to put this back to 0, move this back to 100. Okay, so if you're wondering how to do it like I'm doing it here, I'm actually doing it with keystrokes and a mouse. So instead of having to go to the time configuration, what I do is I hold Alt and Control at the same time. I hold them down, and then I use either the left mouse button or the right mouse button. The left mouse button will move my time slider at the beginning. So I hold it down, and then I'm just moving my mouse left and right. And then the right mouse button will do the same thing, but for the end. So that's a little bit easier than always having to go to the time configuration. Okay, going back to this. So I'm moving this object, but I'm not recording any of that movement. Now the reason why is I don't have any kind of animation mode on. In order to tell 3ds Max, hey, I want you to animate this thing, we actually need to have that on. So there are a couple of different ways that we can do it. If we take a look down here at the bottom, we have auto key, set key. So we can toggle auto key, toggle set key, and then we have set keys by itself. So let's talk about auto key and set key. Auto key, which we can infer from our name, is it's going to automatically key any animation that we have. So if I click on auto key, I'll know that I'm in some kind of animation mode because around my viewport is red. This tells me, hey, you're doing some animation stuff. All right, so from here, still nothing's going on. But if I move an object, still nothing's going on because I'm at frame 0. So basically, 3ds Max doesn't need to record something at frame 0 because it's already there. That's when something's going to start. But if I were to come to frame 50 or whatever and move my object, there's something that I'm going to notice. I've got a key on frame 50, which is where I moved something, and then a key on frame 0. So it stored where I was at frame 0, and then it stores where I went to on frame 50. And it automatically placed a key on my timeline, or 2 keys, because I have auto key enabled. Now another really interesting thing is the color of the key. And you might think, well, the keys are red because my animation window is red. And that's not the case. What the case is that all of our keys are color coded. So for example, if I moved in my X, or for my translation, my movement, I've got one color. If I rotate, I have another color. So we'll see red because I moved it, green because I rotated it, and we'll see at the beginning I have red and green because I have both movement and rotation that have been stored there. And then also, if we scale it, then I see blue. So I have red, green, and blue. And then at the beginning, on that key at frame 0, I have red, green, and blue. The awesome thing about it is you can use the color of that key to determine what's going on. So if I see a red key, I know that something has been moved. If I see a green key, it's been rotated, a blue key, and it's been scaled. So that's really awesome to quickly see in your timeline what's going on. Okay, now the reason why we did configure and show selection range is because I can copy, delete, move keys however I want. And in order to see what's selected, I got to have that show selection range. So I can select a key by just clicking on that key, and then I can move it wherever I want to. I can delete it. I can hold shift, left click, and move my key to copy it. Okay. If I do that with a range of keys, I can also move them around. We see our selection. I can scale them in and out, so make them faster or slower. I can move them. I can copy them. I'm again holding shift and clicking and moving my keys. So these are really, this can really save you time. You know, for example, if you've got an animation of something that's being repeated, then there's no point in recreating those keys if you can just copy them. Okay. So that'll help us. Okay, now what can we key? Or rather, before we get to that, we've looked at auto key. Now let's go to set key. And there is a difference here. And there are some pros and cons to using both. So let's look at set key first before we go into our pros and cons. So set key, again, I see that I have a red border around my viewport. So that tells me I am in an animation mode. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this object. And what we see here that's different is a key was not automatically generated because we are not in auto key, we are in set key. In order to set a key, when you are in set key mode, is you actually have to set a key. So when I click it, we see that it is red, green, and blue, which means it sets a key for position, rotation, and scale. All right, so it still works, but if you don't set the key, if you just move it or rotate it or whatever, it doesn't store it. When I go back, We saw that it went right back to the position it was in before because I did not set that key manually. Now that we've gone over those two things, let's talk about pros and cons of each. One of the biggest pros for auto key is you don't have to worry about, in my opinion, you don't have to worry about whether or not you're going to move something or adjust something and then forget to create a key. It's going to create a key for you automatically. That's a huge pro in my opinion. But one of the biggest negatives, one of the biggest cons about that is that if you're just adjusting something, or you have your auto key on and you adjust your material or you change materials, you have just animated that. So that can be a big pain if you're just trying to assign another material and now it's animated. And then you have to go and you have to dig in your curve editor, which we'll go over in another video. You have to dig in your curve editor to delete those keys, to undo things that you have done. So a huge pro is that it will set all those keys for you. A huge con for auto key is that it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you have auto key on and you're adjusting something, it is animating every bit of it. Now, in contrast, set key, one of the biggest pros is that it's a lot harder to mess things up because it's not automatically setting keys. You have to purposefully set a key. So if I'm messing with my material editor and I'm adjusting like the brightness of an object, or I'm adjusting the bump map setting or whatever, set key doesn't care about that if I don't manually set a key. So that's a huge pro, is it's harder to mess up. But one of the biggest cons is if you're animating and you don't consciously think about setting a key and you move your slider, then all of that stuff, everything that you just did goes away. So you might have spent quite a long time on a pose, on a biped or whatever, or some kind of animated character, and you have it looking just right and everything, and you're like, okay, good, that's a really good in between. So I move my slider and it goes all the way back to what it was before. So you've lost all that work. So that's one huge con. So get comfortable with whichever one you want, but just remember that they both have things that are good about them and things that, you know, could be improved or that we have to keep in mind. So we did talk about how we can animate things like materials. And what I will say is, with the animation system in 3ds Max, almost everything can be animated. If it's a parameter that you can change, then it can be animated. So for example, the length of my box is 68.203 inches. If I move that down, we now see that it has a red bracket around it. This red bracket means that it is animated. So anytime you see anything that has a red little bracket around it, that means it is animated. So if I move now, we can see from frame 0, because that's where we started, to frame 70, I went from the 68.203 to the 20.461. Now, if I wanted that to happen differently, like maybe I don't want it to happen at frame 0, I want it to start at frame 40. So then I can copy that value, Control C, I'm going to go to 40, and I'm going to paste that value. And because I have auto key on, it's going to go ahead and animate that for me. So we're staying the same here. If we take a look at our length from frame 0 to frame 40, we're staying put where we were. And then from 40 to 70, we can see our length changing. Okay, so that's awesome. We can take a look at materials. So let me bring my material editor over here, and we see that there we have the red bracket around there, which means that our animation mode is on, and if we change something, it is going to be animated. So for example, I'm going to come to frame 0, and I'm going to say that my diffuse, I'm going to change it from this color, which is kind of like a gray. Maybe I'm going to change it to an orange. Okay. And then since we started at the beginning, that's what it stays. So let's change this diffuse further down the timeline to maybe like a purple. Okay. Now what we see is we have a red bracket around our ambient and our diffuse. That tells us that something has been animated. So if we go back in our timeline, we can see how we're going from that orangish color. And if I apply this color, it goes from the orangish color to the pink, or the pinkish purple, fuchsia, whatever you want to call it. So we can animate materials. We can animate just about anything with materials. So if we go to our map, we can animate all of these values. If we have multi-sub objects, we can animate values within those multi-sub objects. We can, with our things that we had gone over before, like particle systems, we can animate those values. Pretty much, there's only a few things that I've come across in 3ds Max that you cannot animate. So we've talked about basic animation inside of 3ds Max. Now let's go into a system that's a little bit different, and that's biped. So we're going to go to our Create tab and go to our Systems tab, down to biped, and let's just create a biped. Okay. Now biped, if we notice, if I select this object right here and just move it with our auto key on, okay, before, if we came anywhere in the timeline and moved it, it would just create a frame on frames, or a key on frame 0, and animate from there. Biped is a little bit different. If I go to 25 and move this down, then I'll still move from 25 to 40, but it doesn't have that thing where it will automatically key it. So you can create keys there, but you can also, once you've created your biped and we want to do something with it, we'll go to our Motions tab, because we want motion. We're animating, we're creating motion. And then with biped, we have a lot of different tools that regular objects don't have. So if I go into Key Info, then here I have Set Key, kind of like we have Set Key down here. What that allows us to do, whether we're in automatic, auto key, or set key, when we click Set Key under the Motions tab, Key Info for biped, it will create a key for us. We also have a couple of other keys that we can go over if we do I believe that we have a video on biped, so I won't go over that here since we've already done it. But what we have talked about is basic animation inside of 3ds Max, how we can change animation modes, how we can even turn it off. If we want to play our animation, we have our play options here, whether we want to go back one frame, play our animation, go to the end. There's also shortcut keys, so like question mark on your keyboard will automatically play it, or question mark will also stop it. Our comma and plus, or our greater than, less than, will go forward or back one frame at a time, so that can help us if we're trying to do things quickly. So what I would do is, you have such a wealth of things that you can do with the animation system inside of 3ds Max, and I would challenge you to try to find something that you cannot animate inside 3ds Max using the auto key or set key or whatever, and play around with that. See if you can find something you can't animate, and see, if you can get, the more you do it, the more comfortable you're going to get with the systems inside of 3ds Max. So what I would say, especially with animation, is have fun.